we've talked about offshore voluntary disclosure program. That's not available to you anymore. The streamlined filing programs, they're still available. They're strictly at the IRS's whim, though. They could withdraw that at any point in time, like they did the offshore voluntary disclosure program. Quiet disclosures in the IRS audit manual. Sometimes people say to me, you know, I don't want to do any of those things. I want to do nothing. And they said, that's worked really well for me for the last 40 years. And indeed, probably it has. What I want you to know is things are changing. And the IRS is very keen, and they get beat up in Congress all the time on this subject. How come our citizens abroad and green card holders who live outside the United States are not filing U.S. tax returns like they're required to by law? Now, I'm not going to go into the history of the U.S. taxing people outside the U.S., but it's gone on for many years. It goes back to the Civil War. So this is a significant issue. It's still in U.S. tax law, whether you like it or not. Doing nothing is probably not a great solution for you because things, as we said, are changing. The disclosure of FBAR accounts by people putting money in bank accounts in Switzerland and other jurisdictions and tax havens has become a significant concern, not only to the IRS, but to the U.S. Congress as well. And in 2010, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, was passed. And FATCA's objective is to collect information on U.S. citizens and residents on their financial accounts outside the United States. The Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2010. It actually has what I think is a fascinating history. The history is that the U.S. has been asking U.S. citizens, residents, and green card holders to disclose their financial accounts outside the United States since the 1970s, when there was an attempt to go after the war on drugs with money laundering. And then at 9/11, it was about the war on terror, trying to track bank accounts of U.S. residents overseas. And lastly, in 2008, an employee of a Swiss bank, UBS, went to the IRS and said, our people are actually helping U.S. persons avoid disclosing their financial accounts outside the United States, actually helping tax evasion. The IRS sued UBS for $780 million and won. And in that suit, they also obtained the accounts of 4,500 U.S. persons with Swiss bank accounts representing $19 billion undisclosed U.S. financial accounts. This put Congress into a frenzy, and hence FATCA, or the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, was passed. How does it affect you? Well, FATCA applies to financial institutions outside the United States. If they fail to register with FATCA, they'd be subject to a 30% U.S. withholding tax on all payments made to them, not just interest and dividends and income, but even payments on closing proceeds from the sale of securities and things like that. So financial institutions outside the United States have readily complied with the terms of FATCA, including Canada. If you open a bank account now in Canada, you'll frequently be asked if you're a U.S. citizen or not, or if you're a U.S. resident or not. If you say yes, you are a U.S. person, you'll be required to sign a document under penalties of perjury that discloses certain information, including your Social Security number. If you say no, you're not a U.S. citizen or resident, you'll also be required to sign a different document that states that fact under penalties of perjury. If you refuse to sign anything, many of those financial institutions will not open an account for you. Now, that's not a requirement under U.S. tax law. That's actually their own policy decision. But if they do open an account and you refuse to sign any of those documents, they will in fact treat you as something called a recalcitrant account holder, which is the same as if you were a U.S. person. And they're going to submit that information on you, your financial accounts, the amounts of money in those accounts, and the income earned in those accounts to Canada Revenue Agency. And every year, Canada Revenue Agency is going to supply that information to the IRS. Now, in the perfect world, you'd think that you would instantly get a notice from the IRS saying you didn't file. That has only started to happen now, where the IRS is cross-checking that information saying, we didn't get a tax return from you, sir. Where's your U.S. tax return? There may be other reasons why you're not required to file a U.S. tax return, but once you have that letter from the IRS, you can no longer file under the streamlined filing provisions, and your filing alternatives are limited. And unlike someone who's filing voluntarily, the IRS has found you and is a lot more enthusiastic about the assessment of penalties associated with discovering your failure to file U.S. tax returns. So we've identified a number of different alternatives for you to get current on your U.S. tax returns. In most of these cases, you would have no U.S. tax liability, no U.S. tax penalties. Your biggest cost probably is the fact you'll have professional fees to comply with these things. Can you do it yourself? Oh, absolutely. I mean, tax returns are available online. All this information is in the public domain. The challenge for you typically is understanding all the nuances and how they apply to you in your own situation. That's a service we provide naturally. You're not required to use us, but we do that stuff and we do it frequently. And we look to get our clients the best possible result for them. One of the planning alternatives that we haven't talked about, it's not really a filing strategy, but it may be actually the ultimate end game here, is saying is you have to file U.S. tax returns because you're a U.S. citizen, you're a U.S. resident, or you have a green card, and you can have a green card and reside outside the U.S. and you'd still be obligated to file U.S. tax returns, even if your card is expired or lost. That status represents being a lawful permanent resident. And so all those people have U.S. tax filing obligations, and their failure to file is subject to penalties. So one of the things you may want to think about is, do you want to continue being a U.S. citizen, or do you want to continue being a green card holder, or for that matter, a U.S. resident? Because these filing obligations all come from those statuses. So renouncing U.S. citizenship is a subject by itself, and we're covering that in another video. But that may be something you want to think about pursuing. If it is, or if you want to give up a green card, you have to file a minimum of 5 years of delinquent tax returns. Under the streamlined filing procedure, it only asks for 3, but in this case, you'd want to file 5. And the IRS has said you can do that. You can file additional years as well. In short, what I'd like to say is this: if you're delinquent in your tax filing obligations, you want to be proactive. Doing nothing has been successful for you in the past. It may not be successful for you in the future because of the existence of the FATCA provisions under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act and other circumstances where you can be identified as a U.S. person. The cost of failing to file U.S. tax returns, delinquent U.S. tax returns, can be significant. We've talked a little bit about FBARs and disclosing financial accounts outside the United States. If you have a checking account, a savings account, an investment account, a registered retirement savings account, 4 accounts, the potential penalty starts at $10,000 an account per year for up to 6 years. We're talking about penalties of $240,000, even though the cumulative balance in all those accounts may only be $10,000. So the penalties are a significant issue. If you proactively file those U.S. tax returns, those delinquent U.S. tax returns, you can avoid those penalties entirely. So failing to take action has a much more significant cost to you and exposure. So why would you pay professional fees when you can actually do this yourself? Well, the challenge is this. The instructions are all in English. They're very difficult to understand. And these are complex matters. If you look on any of the forms, you'll see they actually estimate how long it will take you to complete the form and understand the law. In some cases, it's several days to understand the applicable parts. Filing U.S. tax returns for U.S. citizens and green card holders outside the United States is a complex matter. Filing delinquent tax returns with disclosure requirements can be even more complex. Using a professional service provider with experience in these matters can take the stress out of it and get the best possible result. If you haven't disclosed your financial accounts outside the United States, or you haven't filed U.S. tax returns and you're required to do so, you should be proactive and consult with an advisor to determine exactly what your requirements are.